Hey. Love it.
Excellent, excellent. Okay. Um, and then we will have to locate at some point where it puts those recordings. Um, oh yeah, no,
Yeah,
I
you
already
could
have
send
it.
it to me because I made a junk
Yeah.
on it. It sent me a message,
Okay.
so yeah.
All right. Perfect. Okay, so today's subject, and this was one that Zahid especially was very excited about, was the relationship between philosophy and science. So,
Yeah.
um, do we want to go around and just give like our starting views as per
I
usual?
want to give a bit
Sure.
more reason for why I think this is an interesting topic before we start giving our views on it.
Okay, that sounds good. So yeah, Zahid, introduce the topic.
Right, so what I'm interested in is, in practice, the relationship between philosophy and science, and then the proper relationship between philosophy and science. So how should they see each other? Because there's this kind of antagonism between scientists and philosophers. Often it's from scientists, but sometimes it's from philosophers too, where they look down on the other subject or see them as like wrong or not doing things properly, or in the case of scientists, seeing philosophy as unnecessary. So yeah, it'd be interesting to discuss like the history of science and philosophy, how they're connected to each other conceptually, and like how or whether they're valuable, and like how should they be related to each other.
Okay, yeah. So Gavin, do you want to go first with your view
Yeah,
on?
I'll tell you my opinion, which is I think a minority opinion here. But I think that philosophy and science I think philosophy is useless. By that I mean I don't mean that philosophy is useless. I mean philosophy as it's currently practiced today is not very useful. If you were to spend $100 on philosophy and $100 on science, science would get you far more use in the real world by far. And I think in general, philosophy is technically a superset of science. Anything that like you're right that technically everything everything like science does can also be explained via philosophical means. But I also don't think that it's particularly useful as an avenue to pursue. Simply because most of what we kept like let me ask you a question. Why do we set alpha to 0.05? It's just a convention. It doesn't philosophically mean anything deeper. We only said it like this because it's a good trade-off between having not having false results and still being able to make use of results that are probably true. So in that sense, it's a very pragmatic field, and philosophy simply isn't pragmatic in that way. It just goes on and on and on. And to this day, some of the questions that we're debating 2,000 years ago are still going. So I think that philosophy isn't useless, but I think how we pursue philosophy today isn't going to bring us much use in the upcoming few dozen or 100 years. So yeah.
Okay. I think that's a very fair view. So let me sort of explain my point of view, which I think you might be surprised how similar it is. So my point of view is that like science is like the medium term investment, like or short term. Like science gives really great results medium, like by medium I mean on the scale of um like 500 years or like hundreds of years, and by short term I mean on the scale of decades, right? So like science gives amazing results in the medium um and short term, right? Whereas philosophy only really gives good results on like the long term, like on the scale of millennia. In most cases, sometimes it'll speed up and do something interesting within like a few hundred years. um but like I still think that philosophy is a useful investment to make in some degree, because um like you said, because like science as an example is a subset of philosophy, we end up getting science and like the idea of empiricism and hypotheses and doing predictive stuff like from philosophy originally, right? So that was one of the examples of philosophy paying off in a very long range. Um, and like I think it can offer like it can offer further improvements. It just takes a while to happen. And like to give an example, right? Like we have a bit of a crisis of reproducibility in the social sciences, right? And then there was also the example of people putting nonsense in the social science journals and it getting like published and peer reviewed. So like that's an example of where we need to figure out like a better epistemology for that subject matter, and that seems to me like that would be the domain of philosophy. So philosophy is kind of like um, it it comes up with long range tools for science to use, right? Like for example with I think p-values, right, where like it's being set at 0.05 or whatever just for practical purposes. Um, I've been seeing like a lot lately, actually, articles where scientists are talking about like there might be serious problems with like this statistical approach with like significance values and stuff that science has been using, and like that might be contributing to some of the reproducibility problems and stuff like that. And well, where would we get the replacement mechanism, right? Or how do we figure out what the criteria is for something being useful or true, right? And that's what philosophy is supposed to do. Like I agree, you put $100 into philosophy, you're gonna get like 1 cent back per year or something. Like it's like, but and like additionally, like you know, there are also areas where there are areas in science where like things that I would term philosophy, like conceptual analysis and the analysis of like the implications of certain things and like finding correct definitions. That's all the realm of analytic philosophy, and science needs to do that a lot. Like oftentimes I'll read like a study or like a paper that someone has sent me that they think comes to a certain conclusion, and it actually doesn't, like it isn't testing or looking at the right thing and doesn't actually come to that conclusion because how they're defining whatever they're studying is off or like too unclear or just like misidentified. So yeah. So I guess the three things I think is like, yes, so science is more useful in the short and middle term, whereas philosophy is only really useful in the long term. But philosophy can like generate new fields and give new tools to science and like improve science. And there are also things that you do in science that could benefit from a more philosophical approach. I guess that's in short what I'm trying to say.
Shall I go now? Or
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a lot of ways I can go with this. One of the ways I was considering is kind of analyzing what makes a field valuable in general. But I think we can defer that to later, but that might tie into us deciding in these specific instances why these fields are valuable. But I kind of agree with both of you. So I agree that like if we were to spend money, we'd get more from science than philosophy, at least in medium term. And yeah, like I was recently talking to Chris about like this so-called study, which is like a lot of studies that I've seen that said like people that don't believe in free will, determinists, have authoritarian tendencies. And when I looked at the study, it turned out the way that they were defining not believe in free will to keep the study simple only referred to like fatalists or Calvinists or people who don't believe in causation. They believe that like fate is determined, and no matter what course of action you take, the result is the same. And then the kind of authoritarianism that they looked for was specifically religious right-wing authoritarianism for the sake of simplicity, so that they can measure things. And so this is a case where if they just did a little bit more of what we might call philosophy, because they're measuring a different thing, and whether or not it's the same thing is kind of the domain of philosophy, right? And that's just kind of one example. But what I think the job of philosophy is supposed to be is to spawn the science and then watch the scientists do their thing, and then kind of connect it to our experiences and things that we care about. So, like historically, what we call like science, Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin did not call themselves scientists, they called themselves natural philosophers because there wasn't this distinction, because the fields weren't born already yet. And only after centuries of philosophical work coming up with epistemology was science's own discipline. And you have cases where philosophers, I'm forgetting their names, but their writings have basically influenced researches into consciousness today, for instance, or linguistics. And so that's the first thing, to like clarify the concepts, conceptual analysis before it's possible to do any real scientific work. And then you let the scientists do their thing after that stuff's been taken care of. And then you go, what are the implications of this? So like maybe the scientific picture is that the world is looking more and more deterministic, and therefore libertarian free will is like not plausible, and therefore retribution in the justice system for retribution's sake, or moral reasons, this person culpable rather than pragmatic preventative reasons, ceases to make sense. So that has like moral implications, but it's not scientists who are like going to think in that area, because they're here trying to understand how the laws of reality work. It's philosophers who ponder the implications of science. But I agree that it hasn't been done well for a large part of history, and you often have like philosophers making claims about science that they could have empirically verified, like Aristotle saying that men and women have different amount of teeth, which you can just check. And that has like impeded progress. But I do think that there is a proper place, which is what it's like, coming up with conceptual analysis before the science, and then after the science connecting it to the other stuff that isn't, the kind of thing that scientists would normally do.
Yeah, I totally forgot about like working out the implications of science, but I agree with you on that front. But yeah, like I think an interesting, like to support your point about like needing a lot of philosophical development for science to become possible. Like science only really became possible after sort of the mechanistic like ideas of like the Enlightenment started taking hold. So with like Hobbes and to a lesser extent Descartes, and there are a few others that I can't remember at the moment. Where because like originally the starting to view the universe as something that sort of operates according to like rules, like a big like rules that like were about how things interact, and that like sort of expecting it to kind of work like a giant machine, right? That was sort of what allowed science to happen, because previously with the Thomists and Scholastics, it was different. It was more along the lines of Aristotle, where like I don't know, it's sort of hard to explain what it was about Aristotelian thinking that made science difficult, but yeah.
I will say that you guys, I noticed that both of you said that philosophy helped create science, but I actually think that this is more of a historical coincidence than necessarily something that must happen. And I'll give you an example. So, scurvy, right? So for a long time, people didn't really know what was causing it, and it was only in the 1700s when this guy decided to conduct an experiment by feeding some people oranges, some people cider, and other people vinegar. And then he discovered which one healed faster. So I don't necessarily think that you needed philosophy to do this. I think that if someone had decided to start testing folk remedies in such a way, it could have already happened. We can perhaps imagine an alternative scenario in which, like, the Greek or Roman doctors started doing stuff like this and figured it out that way. To be clear,
so the question is, what made him think of testing it and think that would give him an accurate answer, and what made him come up with like the way to test it. And I think
Why?
like
I'll tell
you
you.
seem to be assuming that the sort of naturalistic empirical attitude that is sort of implied by that is like the natural state of the human mind. But like most human cultures, like early human cultures, are actually like more like sort of panpsychists or pantheists, like spiritualists and stuff that wouldn't even really think that you could or should do that kind of experiment. And it actually took a long time to sort of change people's understandings of like how the world might work in order to make coming up with that kind of experiment possible. Now, I do agree that a lot of philosophy, like between a early human spiritualism and B empiricism, was wrong, dead end stuff. But it was more because they're human beings' cognitive faculties are actually pretty bad, and so it takes a lot of like accumulated culture and tools and stuff to start bootstrapping up, because there has to be like it's basically like an error correction mechanism, right? So
Right,
someone
yes.
had to
Science
go
is
through that whole
specifically
process.
designed to overcome these issues, right? To like overcome individual bias by peer review and blind testing.
No, I'll tell you why this guy did it at the time he did it. It's because at the time the British Navy needed a solution. That is the reason why I started testing in such a way. Because they
No,
needed a
but what
solution.
made him think of doing that test in
We
that
can't
way?
right now.
And
We
like,
don't know what an alternative world without philosophy would have looked like. I'm pretty sure it would have been wildly different. So obviously, because philosophy is like, and the Greek and Roman traditions are deeply embedded inside the roots of like British culture, we don't really know what he would have done inside an alternative world. But I can tell you that modern philosophy, as in the stuff we're doing right now, won't help a single bit. And to be honest, I really think that even inside such an alternative world, people would have done this anyway. Why? Because cultures that would have done such a thing would have innovated faster. And it doesn't necessarily have to be philosophers. You can look at the other ones, like, the steam, the Hero's engine, the one that the guy made in 300 BC with steam power. That one, they didn't have such a strong Enlightenment understanding. The only reason why
yeah, well,
the
that's why it died out. That's why no one picked up and
no,
innovated
it's
on it, right?
the reason was the time wasn't ready for it. They didn't. They had slave labor. They didn't need, and they didn't need to mine coal. So
Also, it
they had no
wasn't
need for such a thing.
financially practical. The cost it would take to get coal would make it not pay for itself. It'd be loss. Richard Carey had a talk about, among other things, that he was looking at early Greek and Roman history and how they made crazy scientific innovations, but they also did a lot of bullshit because they didn't have a good way to distinguish between bad methods for reaching truth and good methods because we didn't have philosophy. So
No,
they kind of
they
got
did
this
have
Yeah, well,
philosophy.
I'd also, I mean, I don't, they didn't, they hadn't, they had philosophy, but they
Yeah,
hadn't
they didn't have good philosophy.
developed
That
their
I should.
philosophy. Their philosophy hadn't had time to build up through those really slow bootstrapping error correction mechanisms to a state where it had good, accurate error correction mechanisms for our brains, like empiricism and stuff like that. And I'd also briefly like to add, Gotham, you mentioned the idea that like cultures that were more empirical would have innovated faster and sort of won out. And so even in a world without philosophy, it's sort of more likely that it would be likely that cultures would become predominantly empiricist. And Saeed, I think this is literally exactly what your essay is about. Which I'm sorry I haven't finished reading that final draft, but so maybe you want to respond to that.
I think in terms of making discoveries that are in and of themselves closer to truth, I'd say the Greeks were better at that than the Romans, but the Romans ended up invading them, right? But yeah, I don't think it's strictly true that having a better idea makes society like more prosperous and therefore spread the idea more. And I think there are other factors that go on that can basically result in the opposite, right? You get these invasions, even though you have like a better society, and then you have these dark ages that happen after that.
That's true, but I mean, if we look at the general trend of things, I was thinking more about like post. I guess this is probably a case of correlation more than causation. But I was just noticing that most countries which had like developed the steam engine, etc., went on to completely kind of colonize and destroy the other non-steam engine and developed countries in that way, like around the same time.
Yeah. My sort of point, and I think leads to, is it's not like a foregone conclusion that a society with better ideas will win out.
That's true.
Because what can happen, ideas aren't limited by the bounds of like societies. So a society with worse but more mimetically virulent ideas could spread those ideas to another society, independent of those ideas making the society more or less successful. Just in the same way that like a disease that kills the host can still spread to like a ton of people,
I
as
agree
long
with
as
you.
it keeps the host alive long enough. So like, good ideas don't necessarily win out. Just you know,
Yeah, I think we agree on that. But my actual point was what I was trying to get at this whole time was basically that the way that philosophy evolved into science was because of our history, but it's not necessarily true. And it depends on what your definition of philosophy is. Obviously, people will need to think, and you can consider any kind of thinking philosophy. But what
Well,
I
that's a
was,
cheap win. Yeah, that doesn't really count.
yeah. So, but I guess what I'm really trying to say is, I think that the more ancient kinds of philosophy, like thinking about exactly what the world is, was essential. But if you're talking about this modern day philosophy, that's what I'm arguing is useless. Not like ancient philosophy, like this
well, so
other.
I think like, yeah, I think there's actually a lot of like I said, like epistemology is really necessary even for science, like because science isn't perfect in the like the idea that you can just get like to a more optimal like way of doing science by looking at what's practical is, I think it's like putting too high a like expectation on what's essentially like a greedy best first pathfinding algorithm. So like you kind of need philosophy or something very philosophy like anyway to do the kind of epistemological investigations to figure out which scientific methods are better or worse. Like Popper, who is a philosopher, had a lot of influence on how philosophy is done for a while, but now he's mostly rejected, and in a sense, we're better off for it. And there's stuff happening now where like significance values, like because of the replication crisis and stuff, significance values are falling under suspicion. And well, how do we come up with a replacement or figure out whether they're good or not? You kind of have to do a little philosophy. And then the other thing is that like again, you need conceptual clarity and you need to work out the implications of scientific results, and all of that is still philosophy.
Not
Like,
really. Okay? I'll tell you why. Basically, you could go about this completely without philosophy. You just ask which air standard do we have to set to get things published that will make things that will reduce the chance of people dying from what is it, medicines produced from this paper, and
so how do
that
you do
just
that experiment? Do you do
optimization.
it with Bayesian or significance values?
Um, why don't you run an experiment and whichever one kills more people loses, or something like that? I mean, I guess you
Yeah,
could
well, but
theoretically
how do you
call.
figure out what exactly caused? Like, you'd have to do an actual experiment to figure out which method of
Yes,
doing experiments is better,
sure.
and you'd have to decide what methodology to use to do that experiment. And
Just
so, if
use
you want
whatever's
to
in place at the time. I mean, you can pick really either one. I think they'll probably show the same results, to be honest.
Okay, so how about
and then what about conceptual analysis and working out the implications of philosophy? Like,
I don't believe in implications of philosophy. I think that you can kind of just
I
do
mean,
whatever,
implications
and
of
if it works,
science.
it
implications of
works.
science?
What kind of implications are we
Implications.
talking about here?
So,
Right.
for
What do
instance,
you
like,
want?
I mean, go ahead.
Right. So science will tell you like what if you do this, what can you expect? But you need to go, well, what do we care about and what are we optimizing for, right? And then it turns out people disagree on that. And then the process of trying to come up with a coherent case for one goal that we should optimize is like ethical philosophy, for instance. Right?
That's
So
true.
Yeah,
And then,
you might
yeah.
think that ethical philosophy has reached its conclusion with utilitarianism, but a lot of people wouldn't agree, including me. I think utilitarianism has some truth to it, but it's not the only thing that matters. And B, like you actually have to make the case for that to people, and again, that's philosophy.
There are two ways to
And
convince
C,
people. You can either convince them by convincing them, or you can convince them by kind of.
tricking
Hold on.
them.
There's ways to convince people. You can convince them by convincing them, or you can convince them by putting a gun to their head. I think
Okay,
he's
I'm
probably
back.
gonna say something. Okay, go
Yeah,
ahead.
or I could, or what I was gonna say was, or you can kind of just do whatever you like, convince them by essentially by force. Like, just do whatever you want, and eventually your ideas will permeate into the cultural matrix so much that people are just take them as fact. So, yeah, you don't
Convince
necessarily
them
need
It's
to
with
not
commit
clear to me
philosophy.
that that would work at all.
Of course it works. How do you think people?
that's a practical question, guys.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a practical question. It's you don't need to do any philosophy. It's more of a political and it's more of a political
Well,
thing,
okay,
really.
so take. I still think that there's an important point here, which is that it's not just like utilitarianism that we should do. You want like a specific kind of utilitarianism. You want to clarify concepts. So you're like, I can't remember the extra modifiers you tacked on there, but there's all kinds of utilitarians, right? There's like rule utilitarians and like long-termists and all that jazz,
Sure,
right? And you want to go,
but
you need to be that one, and that's what it means, and that's what we need to optimize for.
oh, that's a good point. Yes, you're right. We probably will need a little bit of philosophy here and there, but
Yeah.
not too much.
Yeah. So like, this is the thing is that so first, the fact I think that like just acting on like utilitarianism, to sort of, and then waiting for people to fall in line, like that. Like that sort of thing only works if the majority of everyone is acting explicitly on utilitarianism, and then the minority of people will get like peer pressure and stuff and fall in line. Like if you're the minority that's acting on utilitarianism explicitly, like what's equally likely to happen if you don't convince people that what you're doing is something that they should like or value, is you'll get a backlash, or you'll have plenty of other people trying to do your strategy with their own systems, and you'll need to convince people who are on the fence which one to sort of fall in line with, as well as having to obviously do conceptual analysis to specify the specific type of utilitarianism you want and why that's, and like explain that and why that's the one you're following.
For what it's worth, the paper, the link that you sent me about a survey of philosophers, 65% of them would prefer running over the one person rather than the 5%. And I think something like 50% of them prefer consequentialism, and only 20% prefer deontology. So we are already, like, utilitarianism is already becoming more and more popular amongst the elite. It's only a matter of time before it percolates down to the general public.
Masses.
Yeah.
I should say consequentialism. And consequentialism can include egoism, rule utilitarianism, various kinds of natural rights theory. Like consequentialism is a very, very wide thing. In fact, I was just talking about G.E. Moore's Pica via Ethica with Said, and his kind of consequentialism is a specific type of rule consequentialism that optimizes for the appreciation of existing beautiful objects and people. Like
That's an interesting one. But
yeah,
on the bright side, it means that he will have to work with us, because in order for him to acquire the most appreciation, the human race will have to survive into the future, which means that he is on our side already.
Well, but your goals will diverge, like in both in means and like. Well, so you're like, well, this is sort of what I mean. Is that like you have to convince him of that, and that's not necessarily.
We don't actually need to convince him right now. So our utility functions may be different, but right now their gradients are the same, if that makes sense. We have to take the same steps in order to get to this. Later, our goals will diverge, but for now,
And
we
you
will
said
get there.
humanity has to survive, but like that's pretty low bar. Like just don't let everyone die. And then-
No, actually, it's harder than you think because there is a lot of existential threats, and beyond that, we also need to make sure that we are increasing the population rather than decreasing it. Otherwise,
the-
how can you
the-
get
the
more
thing is-
appreciation of nature?
The thing though is that like
You get more people looking
depending
away.
on your utility function, like what you're optimizing for, how you solve crises will change. And there might be a situation in which the solution to an existential threat from the point of view of a certain like utility metric might be like as bad as just letting humans become extinct. If your utility metric isn't actually about happiness. And
if you're
like
worried
on
about
top of
like
that,
singularity and the computers can feel much more pleasure than we can, then let them wipe us out, right? Depending on your utility.
It depends, of course, but I
yeah.
don't
So,
see
so like
this.
how you handle what you view as an existential threat, what you view as an existential threat that needs to be dealt with, and how you want to deal with existential threats is all actually highly impacted by your utility function. Like the discussion,
I agree on that 100%.
like the discussion between Bjorn Lomborg and the rest of like society basically about climate change is really interesting because basically he like thinks that if you do like sort of an economic calculation, like we can actually do more good in the meantime before dealing with climate change. And like he's concerned that if we focus only on dealing with climate change, we'll kind of screw everything up in a way that ends up paying off worse than dealing with climate change a little later or something along those lines. And that's because he has a utility function that includes like a bunch of other things besides humanity just surviving. Whereas like a lot of the like people talking about climate change don't really seem to care about like China ending up becoming the dominant world power or like going full authoritarianism or anything like that. Only humanity surviving, right?
Well,
Like,
in a sense, they should, because if they leave it to a power that won't get off Earth fast enough, then that will decrease humanity's chances of survival long term. So really, those other
Right.
guys who don't care about that are leaving something out of the equation which they should have included.
right, but the argument that they should include it is not fully and just an empirical question. It's sort of a philosophical question about what should count in the utility
No,
function.
that is a what? Okay, I'll concede this, that we will need to do some philosophy in the future to disambiguate what exactly utility function is. But what I want to say in this particular case, this is a perfectly empirical question. They do need to take into account China and the future, because humanity surviving this current climate crisis is not the end of the road for humanity. We still need to figure out how we're going to expand beyond Earth.
Right, but like depending on which metrics you include, China is actually doing way better than the U.S. So like I
On
have
which metric?
I have a friend from philosophy club who's actually a huge fan of state capitalism, China style, because it like a centralized, powerful government can react to existential threats decisively, and you know it actually has like more manufacturing capacity and stuff like that as well. So put the two together, and you get an engine that's actually really good at doing like big projects and dealing with existential threats and stuff. And
Yes.
so like from his point of view, like as a semi-long-termist utilitarian, like we actually should all be like he wants China to win essentially, with some caveats perhaps, but not as many as you'd think.
That's an interesting perspective. I've never heard of that before.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah,
think
and, like,
he's right. I mean, I would like us to adopt some aspects of China, but I think in general the way that they're going about things is not really something I would like to follow. Like, especially like with their human rights abuses, I'm not really sure that's very utilitarian.
Yeah, I mean, Yeah, I mean, but I still think that you would have to do convincing. You'd have to do conceptual analysis on utilitarianism and the utility function, and you'd have to. I really think you'd have, like, for the
That
reasons I stated earlier, you'd have to convince people to adopt utilitarianism too. Like,
you don't necessarily like. There are lots of ways to convince people. Most people won't even get convinced from philosophical arguments. They'll get convinced through pop culture and media consumption. So that is really the way to go about it if you want to. Really, the arguments we have are probably enough to convince everyone, if they were immersed in such a culture from birth.
yeah, I mean, maybe.
I mean, think
Like-
about it, right? If your parents were both utilitarians, and you grew up inside a lot of media consumption where like it's implied that obviously the right thing to do is utilitarianism, and so on and so on, you'd just be like, oh yeah, common sense, right? And you'd be astounded at
Well,
how
I mean,
someone could not
both
follow
my
such a.
parents, both my parents, like are Christian. I'm surrounded. I was surrounded with media that was either sort of secular pro-Christian or like actively pro-Christian. I'm very much not a Christian. And it was philosophical.
That is
arguments
a
that
result
convinced
of
me.
consuming culture that is anti-Christian, right? You had to listen to atheist podcasts, you had to look at all these other things, and then change your mind. So, if you never ran into that, you would have remained a Christian.
Okay, so okay, you are correct, but I just sort of want to like take a step back for a moment to say that. So basically, your point is that you can eliminate philosophy if you indoctrinate people hard enough.
Everything is indoctrination. What's philosophy except for indoctrinating people through logos? Right? The goal is to get people to agree with you.
I don't mind being indoctrinated when logic is used. But no, I think you have a point. Like most people follow some kind of Abrahamic faith, not because they've listened to some apologist or read Aquinas or anything like that, but because their parents believed it and their surrounding culture did, and it was the norm.
All I'm saying is
I think that could be the case for utilitarianism.
All I'm saying is saying that the argument that philosophy is useful because it helps to convince people is not valid. You can convince people without using philosophy. That was my argument. I'm not saying it's necessarily good to indoctrinate everyone. I'm just saying you don't need to use philosophy to convince people.
Yeah, but like, I still think that there's sort of like a vector where things filter down from like the intelligentsia to the popular culture, where like in order to like you build like you have the philosophical text on something that introduces people to the idea, and then people if enough people are convinced by that philosophical text of the idea, then they start building into their media and teaching it to their kids and following it and stuff like
Right,
that.
like evolution, right? You have Charles Darwin and evolutionary biologists who have like a detailed understanding of what evolution is, but then that filters down to most people to have like a watered down understanding of evolution.
Sure, you're right.
Yeah. And you don't get that filtering down effect until you get enough people sort of in like in the places where like the higher sort of literary and philosophical culture starts, because everything sort of filters down from there, convinced. And those people tend to be the type of people that are more intellectual than your average person and will want to be philosophically convinced instead of convinced by sophistry.
Yes. But
so, like,
we've already reached that point with utilitarianism, though. People have already written these texts.
I mean, consequentialism, yes, but again, there's a lot of different kinds of consequentialism.
I mean, yes, but what are the relative popularities? I'm willing to bet you $5 that utilitarianism is the most popular form of consequentialism.
I mean, I've seen several professional philosophers on the talk about like utilitarianism, like long-termist or just straight, is actually pretty much disgraced in the philosophical community.
It's not disgraced.
Or not disgraced, but very unpopular.
It is not very unpopular because I know this because I've been reading a lot of a few papers inside the field, and as far as I know, it's still pretty popular. In fact, it's actually popular enough that several people have donated billions of dollars to it if you've ever heard of like the MIRI, MIRI, or there's some other
Yeah.
foundation, I forget the name, but they have something like billions of dollars in funds, which is a lot more than some other kinds of consequentialism. Like, there's no egoists fund.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I do think that there has been some trickling down from utilitarianism, at least, or utilitarian-like consequentialism, where it seems to be like an implicit model for some people, even if they don't have the words for it. Right, like take people like Lawrence Krauss or Neil deGrasse Tyson, who are often like, oh, you know, people need to know more science when they make political decisions, and I think that's like the issue with why people can't disagree, because they're disagreeing with science. And so Krauss was in a talk with Daniel Dennett and Massimo Pigliucci. He's a biologist and a philosopher. He became a biologist first. He's a legit scientist. But he said to Krauss, like, let's say you scientifically determine that redistribution reduces income inequality, right? And then you might go, okay, I believe that, I accept the science, but I care more about liberty than reducing inequality or something like that. And so you need, like, you know, philosophy to decide that. But it seems to me that it's kind of implicit in Krauss, at least, or maybe Neil deGrasse Tyson, that, oh no, that's what you should do. So that's like, it seems to be a kind of utilitarian consequentialism, and it seems to like implicitly value certain things, but without exploring why. And
Well, I think most of the sort of filtered down consequentialism that I've seen among like people like Sean Carroll and Sam Harris and Matt Dillon and like even among like just sort of popular culture people or whatever, is more like a sort of a well-being style of consequentialism, like where well-being isn't just defined in terms of happiness. It's like more eudaemonist than that, although like not strictly eudaemonist. It's like and I like, so yeah, consequentialism is like really popular, like but I think that like there's still a lot of fights to be had over whether it should be rule or simple, and whether it should be eudaemonist or strict utilitarianism and stuff.
Well, the good news
And
is, I think the both of the eudaemonist and pure pleasure utilitarianism, they won't diverge until hundreds of, or maybe even thousands of years into the future, after we've already secured the cosmos.
well, I
Because
mean, not really, because like if you can do things to maximize the happiness that people feel, like putting everyone in heroin tanks, that wouldn't actually maximize their sort of more eudaimonistic well-being, because they're not
I mean,
like,
yes, but that is a far future consideration. Right now, we're not in the end game yet. We still have to play the moves, i.e., acquiring AI, safe AI, and acquiring space travel, and getting out of our solar system, and only then,
but
once
there's
we
stuff
begin.
but there's stuff that
multitask.
we can do in the interim. Like there's sort of the daily upkeep and societal change that sort of happens around those very long-term projects.
Oh,
And
that's a rounding error, honestly. It doesn't really
well,
matter.
yes, but
I mean,
it
if you don't
matters
do
in
it,
the sense
then
that you need to decide like what policies and how to organize your society and stuff in a lot of ways that isn't purely determined by the need to get safe AI or whatever. And that how you do that stuff, like how you do all of the stuff that happens in between the once in a millennia big advances is determined by like what specific utility function you choose, and can diverge drastically depending on whether you're a hedonistic or eudaimonistic consequentialist.
No,
And
actually.
like,
um, both eudaimonists and hedonistics will both agree that the rest of like all these other inconsequential societies, like the other random stuff, it doesn't really matter. We can make we should optimize it as best as we can, but we both fundamentally agree that right now we don't have the resources to put everyone inside a giant tank of heroin.
right, but there's other stuff like for instance, how to deal with like the tension between like liberty and like safety and stuff like that. Like that you kind of need to make a decision on. You can't just not make a decision. And a eudaimonic consequentialist and a hedonic consequentialist would disagree in a lot of cases on stuff like that.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
like, and so it might be a rounding error in the large scale of things, but you can't just ignore it because you're not a large scale creature.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
to be
and-
honest, if this actually came into a problem, I would probably use it as a bargaining chip to get other things I wanted out of the other person. Because to me, it doesn't really make too much of a difference one way or the other. Like, sure, they get to have their liberty. All right, that's nice. It'll probably increase their hedonistic happiness at least by like 50%, even though I miss out on some 25% improvements. That's fine. I can use it to leverage to increase our chance of getting to space by like 5% or something like that. It doesn't really matter.
Let's try to circle a bit back. So I think we got you to like provisionally agree that you still need philosophy, even if we agree with
I never said we
Yeah,
didn't
right.
need philosophy. Even at the beginning, I said I think we need some degree of philosophy. I just think the way philosophy is done now is not very productive.
Yeah,
it could be
and
made more productive. And do you have any ideas on how?
Yes, we need to start treating it like engineering. Because fundamentally, that's what it is. We are trying to engineer a better science. And that's how we need to approach it, right? Like, we don't need to start thinking about all these abstracts. We can just think, what gives us better science? Let's work on that. And so on, you know? And basically, it's just kind of like designing a society or designing something else, like a car. You just figure out what works and what doesn't, fundamentally.
yeah, I mean, there's a degree to which I actually agree with that. Where like philosophy would be better first of all if it was integrated. Like right now, we've got everyone kind of working on their own like little thing, and nobody's like trying to get together and combine disciplines in the way that they do it in like science or engineering or something. And that's a big problem. We've got a bunch of pieces, but none of it fits together. And like the other thing is like, I agree to a certain degree that philosophy needs to refocus. It needs to focus on, in my opinion at least, understanding what people actually value, which you could phrase if you're a utilitarian as understanding like what things are most closely tied into making people happy, and like how to motivate people to be utilitarian, and like so that's ethics, right? And then epistemology, like figuring out how to make a better science. But I think that in order to do that, you need to answer questions about like what is science figuring out? Is it figuring out things that just kind of happen to be useful, or is it giving us an accurate picture of the world? And like, should we care about an accurate picture or not?
I think
And like, because that actually influences how you look at significance values and probability and stuff like that. And you need to figure out like, and I think there's a place for sort of like philosophy / linguistics as well, like figuring out how to use language clearly and how to do logic and what relationship mathematics has to things. And there's also conceptual analysis, like making sure that you have clear, consistent, useful definitions so you can study them using science. And then I think there's also space to some degree for political philosophy, like, because like with like the humanities, with studying like society and how people interact and stuff, it's actually pretty hard to do scientifically. And so like you kind of like philosophy in that sense is like the inferior like glue that you use between science, where like you sort of run out of science in like this area and there's a gap, and so you need some philosophy to paste it over, right? Or
maybe, I don't know. I feel like in general there are a lot of things you could do, but at the same time you have to be wary of like wasting too much money on something that could have been spent in better ways. Like a lot of that stuff is useful, but at the same time I don't really see the need to like make it as big as science in order to accomplish these goals.
Yeah, I mean hell, like I think that to a large degree, like people will kind of do philosophy for free. So like, you know, you don't even necessarily need to invest a lot in it at all. I do think though that there's sort of like like, so yeah, I don't like most of philosophy. I think most of philosophy is useless word games. But I do
Exactly,
think that
right?
I think there is actually there are some things that philosophy is actually really useful and necessary for, and I think you're maybe underestimating a little bit, like how much of a payoff you can get from it.
Can you paint for me a picture what an example of like a giant payoff would be? Like, let's say I invested 500 million into philosophy program around the country. What can I expect to get from it inside the next 10, 20, 100 years, right?
I
Like,
actually,
what
if
would be the kind of revolutionary discovery we could make from it?
I think if philosophical naturalism was more widespread, then mental health would see like a serious improvement. If people stopped believing in dualism and believed in things like the mind as having a physical basis and working according to our laws of physics and causality, and they've ceased to like blame people for their brains being a certain way and would instead seek to treat them. And that seems to be like an issue requiring like certain kind of philosophy to trickle down, and that seems like that would have big payoff.
No, I think most people accept this inside the US. It's a matter of reaching other parts of the world. So really, that's not philosophy, that's just advertising and marketing.
Yeah, no, sort of. There is
No context quotes.
yeah, there. Okay, so there was something, but I can't like I wouldn't even say invest like 50 million in philosophy or something. Like I would just say, like okay, so sorry, there was something important that I was thinking of, but it's escaped me now. I'll have to get back to you on it. But like I do also want to add like, and this is a sort of like almost a side tangent to what we were talking about, but I still think it's sort of relevant. Is I think that like people will kind of continue to do even like the useless kinds of philosophy, like sort of because it's interesting. It's kind of fun and curious. Like if people are curious and like it, like there's a lot of philosophy that you can kind of view like some kind of cultural enrichment thing, where like investigating this sort of thing is like leads to like just enjoyment from like it makes the person doing it more fulfilled, right? Because they're getting to kind of use their minds in interesting ways and try to write beautifully or something like that.
I mean,
And
that's why we're
the
all
people
here,
that
right?
read it, what?
We obviously like all three of us here like philosophy. That's why we're doing this in our free time. So
And Craig.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think like having. So let's go back to like the first question that we ever covered, which is like, what is the meaning of life, right? Like that's a really dumb, meaningless question, right? Like
it's not that meaningless. I think it's a very reasonable question to ask. But sadly, we don't have any good answers.
yeah, but like sort of contemplating that question is actually really beneficial to people because actually let me use a more specific example. So you know the existentialists, that's Albert Camus for one,
Yes.
I believe Simone de Beauvoir, Sartre. So I think that their philosophy is very much not the kind of philosophy that we were saying was useful earlier. But the ideas of existentialism, the idea that like you have to like there is no like one size fits all external meaning for your life, and in order to have a good life you need to select a meaning, be responsible for it, and be like, and that like there's nothing like you need, and like you're not beholden like necessarily to anyone for your choices, and so you need to sort of figure out what you're going to do it, and take responsibility for what happens, right? That has a lot, that sort of the arguments that they make for that, and the ways that they talk about how to go about constructing a meaning for yourself and living a life like that, it is very meaningful, and I think like it actually improves mental health. Like a lot of the songs, like about suicide and stuff that I've heard, and poems and stuff, seem to rely very heavily on existentialist themes, and I think it's because existentialism as a philosophy is actually really taps into something interesting about humans that psychology hasn't fully got, and can't explain in as like as captivating a way, and but this philosophy does in a way that actually saves people from like suicide or depression or unhappiness in that sense, you know. So like I don't know, like I think there's a usefulness to philosophy for science related things and like ethics related things, but I think there's also a usefulness in philosophy for sort of like personal psychology, and like literature related things as well, that shouldn't really be overlooked.
Yeah, I would agree that there's like a personal impact that's important. And that's kind of what I meant. One of the things I meant
like
about the
having
implications of philosophy, of science, I mean.
yeah like having so
Yeah.
if you tell someone that they don't have free will, that can be really scary and upsetting to them, unless you sort of do philosophy to explain to them how that doesn't necessarily mean what they think it means, and how they like give them sort of an idea of how to go about like integrating that into how they understand themselves and how they live their lives in a way that's like consistent and but is meaningful and valuable to them, right? And that's sort of like that's all about that's what continental philosophy is all about, is sort of like figuring out the human condition and explaining different like templates that you can use to deal with it, right?
I don't
And
believe in the human condition. I just don't understand what it's supposed to mean. Like, I never got.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the human condition is basically like we're dropped in a world devoid of intrinsic meaning, and we have these certain desires, and there are other things that seem like us, but we can't ever fully understand them, and we have to figure out what to do and how to conceptualize ourselves and how to find something that's like meaningful to do with ourselves.
Isn't that basically the question we try to ask like the first time, like what is the meaning of life?
Yeah, well, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. And so like that's not a question that is useful in the sense that having different philosophies try to answer that, like Nietzsche, the existentialists, Aristotle, having different philosophies try to answer that question isn't really useful in a direct sense, but I think it leads to a more enriched it leads to a culture that is more rich with ideas to help people deal with their problems and conceptualize themselves and be happier on an individual level. So it's kind of like you can see that kind of philosophy as a way to do without any particularly like a way to give people like tools to like I don't know just be happier, right? So like I don't know.
Yeah, it won't get you to the moon, but it'll make you happier on Earth. But you might not want that, obviously.
This is where the heroin tanks come in.
Well, it's sort of a way to do the heroin tanks without like short-circuiting things or any of the sort of odd problems that might come with that.
Yes.
Yeah, especially since there seems to be like not only like a sensitivity towards the like specific hormone or chemical, but the stimulus itself. So if you use the same stimulus, right, your brain can like get used to it and require more for the same effect. But if you have a different stimulus, even if it ends up producing the same chemical, it seems to like work afresh.
Yeah, I actually saw a really interesting study recently from psychology. So this is actually science that's sort of talking about this, where some people like what it seems like what they want most and what makes them happiest is not like the things that you would normally expect. Like the other two options they had was like hedonistic and like connection to society or something like that. Or sorry, so there were three options. It was I think having like a singular purpose or goal to achieve, having like healthy like a good material surroundings and good connections to like a social network, and then having a life that's filled with like variety, like a variety of stimuli, some of them painful, some of them pleasurable. And this study seems to indicate that maybe it's the third one that's like more accurately reflecting what people want. And like this goes back to what Saeed was saying, which I said to him I think yesterday, which is like the brain will kind of, if you constantly give it one stimulus, it'll actually like eventually need more and more and then just burn out and not recognize the stimulus anymore. And then like what you've basically done is giving yourself depression. Because like what depression, clinical depression is the inability to feel positive, like in your brain's inability to process positive chemicals, like reward chemicals. And like I don't know if you know, but like clinical depression is very unpleasant apparently, or so I've been told. So like, you know, like the way that like philosophy, like existentialism and stuff works is by essentially stabilizing people's, like clamping people's rewards, like payoff chemicals between like ranges and allowing them to process like a variety of emotions, pleasant and unpleasant, but be able to conceptualize it in such a way that they don't like lose like perspective or all desire to live and stuff. And so it actually maximizes the payoff because you can have the variety without the as much of the danger of there ending up being too much of a divergence in one direction for a bit and like going off the deep end or something.
I think science is like too piecemeal and inaccessible to most people to do this, right? Where really you want like this framework of this is how you act, and you want to group together the different observations from science so that people can live those kind of lives, and you want it so that the average person can follow it, right? And so you kind of figure out in philosophy looking at science, and then you find a way to spread it so that the average person can have access to it.
Well, yeah, and a lot of this isn't actually like really easily verifiable using science. Like psychology is not a like the hardest science ever, and so like what the existentialists did is they looked at the people around them and they sort of introspected and used intuition, right? And that's usually way inferior to science. But the subject matter that someone's introspection can cover is actually way more detailed and in depth than the subject matter of what psychology can easily cover using empirical methods. And so you run the risk of making it too specific to the one person, but it also you also can sort of have the possible benefit of it speaking really deeply to people, and getting at something that's hard to do with science.
Okay, I have to go eat lunch right now, but see you guys. And it was a good conversation.
Okay, yeah. It was good talking to you. See ya.
See ya.
See ya. All right, I'm going to say something that he'd probably agree with, which is a shame. You still there?
Yeah.
All right, yeah. My thing that I think would fix philosophy is if they were more deeply acquainted with the science. So I'll give like a thought experiment. So imagine people believe the Earth is flat, right? This is thousands of years ago, and then they start going, oh, what goes up must come down. They like extrapolate from their intuition, and then they go, well, something must be supporting the Earth, otherwise it would go down, right? And then maybe it's a giant turtle or something, and then something must be supporting that ad infinitum. And then imagine you have like decades or even centuries of like discussion on this, and the prehistoric William Lane Craig is arguing that you need this like infinitely big turtle or something at the bottom, right? And it's just like this giant detour and waste of time. And once you discover that the Earth is round, things are kind of just floating in space, but gravity makes stuff move towards each other depending on their mass. It's like the whole, all of that kind of becomes this waste of time, right?
Yeah.
And I think this can apply in other cases too, where like philosophers discuss something that they extrapolate from their intuition that science could make irrelevant. And so I'm
So I think,
conjecturing that.
yeah, I think this is actually a case in which you need philosophy in order to decide what is the right method to use when. Because if you have a correct epistemology, then you
Yeah,
know what you can get from science and what you can get from introspection and reason, and you know when to use them, right? And so, like, even if science didn't originate from correct epistemology, which I doubt, and even if there isn't a lot of improvement through like that science needs to get from philosophy, you still need overarching philosophy to decide when to use science and when not to, and how
yeah,
much you should trust science. For instance, if science is contradicting something that like is just like a phenomenological like basic thing in my experience, like then I need to discard science, right? But that's not something science would tell you. Um, so like
yeah.
you know,
I agree with
um,
that. I do think that like the
like
philosophical
like
Overton window is impacted by your current or the ambient scientific understanding. So the kind of
oh
things that
yes,
you'd
no,
even like
I
start
totally
to
agree.
consider.
Yeah,
And if
I
you
think
want
like
that to be in the best range, you want to have a good picture of science so that you don't like overstep it, you know.
yes, yeah, oh totally. But like I think like there have been a lot of cases where someone said like, oh, I have a study that proves X. And I
Yeah.
go, well, I've done some extensive reasoning that indicates that that's almost definitely not true. Um, but all that reasoning is basically on intuition, introspection, and reason. So let me look at the study. And I look at the study, and I look at it more closely than I would have otherwise because my philosophy
Yeah.
is telling me this is probably wrong. And it turns out to be fucking dumb because they didn't do correct conceptual analysis or didn't work out what the implications of the data is correctly. Because again, data doesn't speak for itself. You come up with theories and hypotheses and stuff by doing philosophy. Like and so
Yeah.
like you just have a bunch of scientists doing philosophy badly, and it just so happens that most of the time it turns out okay.
So they should also do more philosophy. I agree. Like this is the when you operationalize a concept, right? When you go, well, we're trying to measure this, but like we need an easy way to measure it. So an easy thing to identify so what you look at and go, okay, that's this. And uh, that's kind of a domain of philosophy. Okay, so you need to like make it measurable, and that can make things hard because we need to find things that like how do you measure honesty, for instance? Is it lies per day or is it like magnitude of lies, like how much or something like that, like how serious the lie is or something? Um and that's the bit where they often get it wrong, and then it's like garbage in, garbage out. It doesn't matter if everything else that they did was perfect. The
Yeah.
conclusion that they came up with just doesn't follow. So yeah, I would agree that you kind of need this increased skepticism, and you need like to merge them both together. But yeah, I
Yeah.
was just I still think that like okay, so social science is largely like a large, maybe a majority percentage of it is useless because of this. But science as a whole is pretty valuable. And I was going to get into uh, what I was thinking of getting into from the beginning is like what is valuable about science, what is valuable about philosophy, and then like what how do we decide like what makes a field valuable? But I thought we might get carried away and not talk about the relationship between the two. But
I did want to mention something real quick before we move on, which is that
I
um to go back to an earlier point I was thinking about the existentialists, it seems that on the basis of like personal philosophy, like for understanding how to conceptualize yourself and how to live and stuff like that, existentialism has basically won, especially in the cultural like milieu,
oh
like I was
yeah.
talking about, like when people talk about suicide and stuff, and mental health, like existentialism is it. Like, it is the thing. Nothing else really, like, and like,
I mean,
I'm
maybe
not sure that,
Christianity isn't like,
yeah, well, but so ignoring religion for a moment. Um, outside of
I'd love
religion,
to.
which is very obviously just a harmful meme, it's basically existentialism that has won out. And I think it's because it's like it obviously taps into something, like it has like this deep cut into like the human psyche. I think there are aspects of psychologists and like psychiatrists and stuff and how people think about, like, there are things that this existentialism needs to be supplemented with. I think it needs to be supplemented with a sort of eudaimonic view as well. And to a certain degree, that has been the case with like the idea of like self-actualization and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and people starting to understand the need for hobbies and stuff like that. But like, it is interesting that something seems to have won out so clearly.
Yeah, and yeah, there's like plenty of articles saying, oh yeah, you shouldn't feel guilty about this. This is normal, you're doing this during quarantine or whatever. So I think there's an increased kind of ambient understanding, reduction of guilt, and uh, the idea that like, no, it's perfectly fine for you to seek what you find meaningful. There's not, some kind of duty that you're neglecting. Um,
Yeah,
like,
like
uh,
the whole idea that like you can just be like the most, like, the goal is to kind of become the best version of yourself as determined by you and your natural abilities and inclinations, and not by anyone else. Like, that's new, and I think, and that's very existentialist and also very Nietzschean, and and it's also, I think, very helpful, you know.
yeah, I'd say it's definitely a step forwards in the right direction. Um,
Yeah.
and it actually ties into some of the stuff that I was thinking of about like what makes a field valuable. But I think maybe I'll start with the instance and then go to the general rule and then maybe go back to the instance. So
Okay, so
we
do the
we've said
Marxist
like
thing.
oh shit, okay. I'm kidding. Yeah, so like we said why philosophy is useful, right? Or we started with that. We might have new stuff to say about it after we say what makes the field valuable. But what I think like so I think in science, in like when you're doing science, you shouldn't be thinking about how you can use it. You should be trying to understand the world. But I think that's because when scientists do that, it ends up producing the most utility long term, right? Because you
Yeah.
don't know ahead of time what are like the fruitful avenues. You don't know like this will make it possible to
Yeah.
like for example, Einstein 100 years ago, his work on the photoelectric effect and like physicists' work on quantum mechanics, which seems kind of esoteric, is practical. It's how we get lasers. It's how we get computer screens. It's how we get like circuits working. It's why we're running into quantum tunneling issues when we try to make microchips too small. So it has an impact on Moore's law, for instance. So they couldn't have predicted that because they didn't have personal computers. They weren't looking to be useful. They were looking to, discover the truth of the world. Um,
Yeah, see,
but I
this
do.
is, yeah,
Go
this is
on.
the thing. It's like truth is always useful. You just don't necessarily know how yet.
Yeah, because like if you want to, because useful in a sense means like navigate reality as best as you can, right? If you can
Yeah.
imagine it's a kind of maze and you want to go from A to B because you care about B or something like that, but you need to like you need to like know the shape of the maze so that you can get there. That's so that's why I think the
Yeah.
distinction isn't very useful. But Krauss says, it gives people something to hope for. So it's not just, having a better phone or something like that. And I guess there are like plenty of scientists and physicists, mathematicians, etc., who like, feel feelings of awe and beauty when they're doing their work, and that's why they do it. But I don't think that's necessarily the value of the subject. I think the value is ultimately like the way it makes people's lives better. So I don't think it's like, oh great, we know more, that's cool, that's like exactly why we're doing this. I do think that like the value, oh shit, I'm being a Marxist here. I'm saying there's inherent value in this. The value is in like how it improves people's lives, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean like, oh yeah, no, you don't get to do this anymore because I don't know how it'll improve my life. Especially
Yeah.
because the science, they are investigating truth. And I'd probably say the philosophy and science metaphor, right, is like philosophy, it's like building the foundation for like a company, and then science is like the developers and designers and all the people in the company making the stuff, and then philosophy, it's not so you get like a bunch of nerds, hacking shit together, and then philosophy is kind of like, hang on a second, this thing that you made, this if you put this together, you get, I don't know, this search algorithm or something that makes people have instant access to knowledge, right? It's kind of a, I guess, entrepreneur in that story.
Yeah.
I
I'm
don't know.
not
I
sure if
just
that's exactly the right analogy, but I sort of see what you're getting at. Yeah. It's just like in my mind, yeah, like yeah, I don't know. Um,
yeah. I
I
mean,
just
I
like
just made it up. I didn't really think it through that far, but
yeah.
I'd
I
be
mean,
inclined to give more value to science, even though I give credit to philosophy for coming up with it in the
yeah.
first place.
I mean, yes, but I still think we need to figure out our ethics. And I don't think that consequentialism or utilitarianism has won its final victory. And B, I actually think that the actual content of ideas beyond just their marketing and the sophistry around them is actually important to whether they survive and win out long term and stuff. And I don't think that like long termist utilitarianism is it or even really will be or can be it. Like I don't think yeah. So
Actually, I'm going to revise my earlier statement. Thinking things through, I would actually give more credit to philosophy than science because the Enlightenment is the reason why life here is not like life in the Middle East.
yeah.
Right? We,
Well
we both have the
that's the other
science.
thing is like it wasn't like you I don't really think you can actually use science on politics to determine so I've been talking about how like you can philosophy lets you do a deep cut into internal psyche in a way that psychology can't in order to figure out how people can conceptualize themselves and try to live and want to live and stuff. But that right there has huge implications for a consequentialist because that influences how you need to let and promote people living and thus has huge implications for politics that you can't like merely decide on the basis of statistics because like if your politics is after trying to make people as happy as possible in some way, whether you're doing like hedonic consequentialism or eudaimonistic consequentialism, that philosophical aspect of like how it actually is best to live on a personal level influences all of that, and it isn't really something that you can actually answer with science directly. Like even if you could sort of look at every hypothetical, like somehow run experiments on every hypothetical societal structure, which you can't because that societal like in order to do that, the societal structure would have to be smaller than a full scale, and scale affects things hugely, and it would have to be nested inside something else, which would change the outcome, and they'd have to be aware that the experiment was happening, which would change. Like I don't think you actually can do social science really in a way that's like remotely useful. Right? But even if you could, and you concluded that like people rated themselves as happier in like different societies. That can tell you something, but it can't tell you too much without philosophy because you need to decide if straight happiness is what you're after, and you also need to decide what questions to put on the questionnaire to figure out how like happy people are and what the definition of happy is.
Yeah, and the problem
So
is
like
always with like self-rating happiness is that rational people underrate their own happiness, not because they're less happy, but because they want to get they're more concerned of getting the number correct, right? So they're not going to go, oh yeah, I'm an 8 out of 10, even though they can remember a time when they were like, let's say, twice as happy or something.
yeah.
Uh,
So I think like you you need philosophy and ethical philosophy, and you need philosophy for personal reasons, but those personal reasons will bubble up and have implications on everything else. Like, and will also fill in places that philosophy, like I think there are places that philosophy can go that science just can't go, that are actually really important to figure out what you should do about with society and stuff.
Okay, this last sentence that you just said, it's good that you mentioned it because one of the things I wanted to be careful about doing and maybe discuss is like, I want to give a place for like philosophy to be valuable in places where science couldn't, without giving a space for woo nonsense to like go, science isn't the only way to get the truth. You need us too. You need this kind of bullshit, right? But we were talking about like practical. Okay.
Yeah, so like you can acknowledge that science isn't the only way to get at truth without A, saying that science isn't the best way to get at truth when it's available, and without B, allowing um, saying that the other way to get truth is something that actively contradicts science or is like incoherent. Like and how you figure out if something's incoherent, like if something is woo, is if it either contradicts science or you use philosophy to analyze it and realize that the arguments that they make are bad.
Yeah,
So
I
like
mean,
acknowledging that there's a place for philosophy where science can't quite get to. Um, does not doesn't at all actually open it up to woo because woo fails on both the scientific and the philosophy counts. So like
yeah, but it seems to me like if you're not using like some expansive definition of science, and if you're saying, there's other ways in science, and you try to smuggle in your favorite thing, and then someone else brings in their favorite thing, and you're like, no, you can't do that. You have to be ready to provide an account like you just did that like kind of works against all the objections that they'll have, right? And so you have to go, all right, well,
yeah,
here's
no,
kind of this meta
if you
theory.
bring in, I mean, if you bring in philosophy, like if you say philosophy is a valid way of knowing things in places where science can't go, first of all, that immediately eliminates a lot of woo because a lot of woo is actually talking about things that science could check.
Yeah.
But like it, like for the woo that would try to go where philosophy is, you say, okay, let's put your woo to the test. Like let's actually analyze your reasoning, see if it follows. Um, analyze your language, see if it means anything. Um, and like, yeah, you have to be willing to fend off nonsense, but you have to kind of be willing to do that in any case, like all the time anyway. So,
That's true.
like, and I think that saying, well, if we open things up to philosophy, the woo people might try to sidle in too. So we should only allow science. It's throwing the baby out with the bathwater,
I'm not
right? It's
saying that.
like
I'm saying
saying,
once you say that, you need to be ready with a response, because I do think that philosophy is also valuable.
yeah, well, my response is like, all right, give me the reasoning. Come at me, bro. Let's see if it holds up.
Yeah, and yeah, ask them like, how is this a method that actually gets you in here? So like, oftentimes people say, "Oh, religion is a path to truth," and it's like, well, oh, it's a method for it's a way answers different questions to science, and it's like it says answers, but it has no process of like coming up with answers in a way that's likely to be true.
Yeah. Like
Unless if they
my favorite
define truth
example.
as God, in which case, oh god.
Yeah. I mean, the best example of this in my mind, at least, that I'm aware of, besides like sort of the internal philosophy that the existentialists do, is praxeology. Because like sociology should inform economics, but it doesn't. And microeconomics should inform macroeconomics, but it doesn't. And economics and sociology are all extremely dysfunctional because like social science doesn't really work very well on humans. And so the praxeologists will be like, okay, what we're doing is in theory kind of inferior to science. Like we'd rather use science here, but it doesn't look like you can. Or you can't very well anyway. So let's try to come up with a method that has some chance of being successful where science isn't, right? I'm not talking about Mises. Mises is really nonsense with his epistemology. But like I'm talking about sort of the approach that like Rothbard kind of takes to this. Where it's like sort of semi-empirical. And so like, I think and so you try to look at like, what are the major driving forces in how people act? And it's because they want to use things to achieve goals, right? And then you try to figure out what that means by like just thinking about like how you understand what it is to act and stuff like that. And then you try to work that out. And yeah, like it's not as it would be convenient. It would be better to use science, but they're trying to give an account of why this would work in this case and why science maybe isn't the right answer in this case, and then use solid reasoning.
Mhm. Okay.
And like even religion tries to do this to a certain degree with reformed epistemology. Like what Plantinga is trying to do with reformed epistemology is explain why faith is actually like a process that can lead to truth. So that they can kind of fill in this gap in this same way. And it doesn't work, but he tried.
Yeah, and so that's an interesting thing. So one of the things that like scientists who are antagonistic to philosophy would do is go, oh look, all these philosophers saying these things, and then you go, well, that's bad philosophy, but this is good philosophy, and like you point out the errors in reasoning. And then I go, but anyone can say anything or something, but I think you can do that. I think you really can go, no, here's the error in reasoning, and then you can say, well, there are flat earthers today, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna say. It's like you can play the same game with science. Like science is bad because like look at these people doing an obviously wrong conclusion, and then they'll say, well, like like their theories based on the data is wrong or whatever. They'll point out the flaws, and you can go, well, who's really to say? You're just using your version of science, but they seem to have another version of science. In the same way that like a scientist will say, if you criticize another philosopher, well, you just think they're wrong because you hold to a different philosophical view, and of course they think you're wrong too. So like it cancels out. But it's possible, to be right or wrong in philosophy.
Okay. Yeah. Although Graham Oppy was saying like he doesn't think that there are currently at least any arguments that require a reasonable person to believe that they're true. Only that like they're more likely or something like that. But like not like a reasonable person can go either way. At least that's the current state of things. But I didn't quite understand everything, but that's just interesting.
I mean, I'm not really sure that's true.
Yeah, well, let's stay on topic a bit. So, right, let's see.
I mean, I mean, I think we've sort of exhausted the topic to a certain degree. I mean, we're going to do this as a podcast, and it's been an hour and a half.
Okay, fair
Um,
enough.
and one of our hosts has left. So
That's true. I think I would have liked to see his commentary and some of the stuff that I said after, because I think he would have like agreed that there'd be less time wasting if philosophers were more acquainted of science, and then they can talk about the relevant things, but the implications of the actual science that we have now.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think his main problem with what I said after he left would be that he doesn't agree that the social sciences are as problematic as I think they are. Um, but I've never really understood why he thinks that you could actually surmount the problems with the social sciences in a way that would make them much more effective than philosophy. So I would have.
I
I
mean,
feel like that discussion with
in
him would
terms
have
of
been kind of
sociology,
fruitless in a
there's
way.
like significant ideological motivation that, like with other sciences, you have people of different faiths and ideologies, but I think they do a much better job of like leaving their faith outside the lab, right? Whereas sociologists don't do this. Most of them start off with their motivations, um, and it completely like colors how they try to do things. And like they even say, "Oh no, you need to do this, otherwise you're standing with the oppressors." So they're literally like, you need to do this confirmation bias, right? That they see it as their duty. Hmm?
Yeah, yeah. There are a lot more problems with social sciences, more basic ones, but that is another one as well.
So yeah, I mean, I would agree that maybe like in principle, there's just limits. I mean, you can't do it well. But I do think that they're just so bad at it, and not because of like essential limits, but because they're morons. That if they weren't, and if they got their shit together, they could do something more useful.
Yeah, but why do you think it is that all of the biased morons have self-selected into sociology? Because it doesn't seem it seems like that would be something that would be caused by a fundamental problem with the field. Because
I think it's just like in the alchemy
otherwise
phase. It could just be in like the alchemy phase, right? Or astrology.
maybe. Yeah, but maybe it's also something inherent about sociology that sort of either selects those people in or gives them more free reign to be idiots than the hard sciences
I
would.
think it might be this kind of ambient non-naturalism, specifically for minds, because that's like the frontier that hasn't been covered enough yet. That could be kind of encouraging, wishy-washy bullshit in a way that it would have been when people believe supernatural things about physics and the cosmos,
Yeah.
and we're doing
But then there's
astrology.
behaviorism and behavioral economics,
Oh yeah, that's the thing. So
which
with reductionism, right? Kind of there's people that believe, wishy-washy bullshit, but at the same time, they can recognize that there are these like complex phenomena, right? And then there's people that are like, oh yeah, no, it's just matter, but then they ignore that it's complex phenomena as well. And I think
yeah,
that they're both wrong. And I think the reasonable view is, well, our introspection, our experience leads us to believe that this is a complex phenomenon, but it's made of matter. You don't have to like make up new things. Um,
yeah,
But yeah, no, I agree that behaviorism is an issue in psychology and even like human behavioral biology, and it's like kind of ridiculous, but but yeah,
yeah. All right. Yeah. So, um, yeah, I'll post this as a podcast when you send me the recording.
yeah, I'll figure out a way to send it that's memory nice. Yeah, all right, this is good.
I mean, I think Craig just puts a link, so you could send me the link.
Okay,
Yeah. All right. Yeah. It was good talking to you.
good talking to you too.
Yeah. Talk to you later.